the kind of environmental pressures that I've talked about already today, I haven't as directly linked it to the kind of conflict outcomes that we focused on in this class. And in this video, I want to talk about how environmental pressures have a direct and indirect relationship to conflict, as well as conflict shaping those environmental pressures. And I want to talk about several of them today and then link it to the case study of Syria, which is the last topic for this week. So the Gleditsch et al. Reading looks at the direct and indirect effects between environmental stress and conflict. Again, talking about how, even going back to week 1, we've talked about the possibility of direct and indirect effects between the kind of factors that we care about and the most extreme forms of political violence. And in this class, I focused on those extreme forms of violence because civil conflict is the largest form of organized political violence in the world today. And so from a normative perspective, we want to understand why it happens so that we could try to prevent it from happening in the future. But then also, if these factors apply at that extreme level, they should also theoretically apply at less extreme forms of violence. So the direct effect they talk about is environmental stress leads to migration from region A and then conflict in region B, which could be so people move from region A and then move to region B, and then there's conflict. We're going to be talking about that in the next couple weeks, examples of pastoralists and agriculturalists at a group level, as well as a bunch of other forms of conflict. Indirect effects would be environmental stress leads to conflict in region A, then migration from region A, and then conflict in region B. I think this would connect to the Rwandan example we had last week, in which you had environmental stress theoretically, though Percival and Homer Dixon talk about how there's not compelling evidence for it, but there's a potential for conflict in that home country, which could lead people to migrate to a neighboring country like the DRC, and then the potential for violence in that destination country, like unfortunately DRC saw. So those are two different ways of modeling direct and indirect pathways. For your own research, I'd be interested to see if you could try to put together a theoretical model like this, which succinctly and graphically kind of shows that relationship, as well as the potential for readers or for yourself to complicate it in other ways by adding other factors or drawing arrows the other direction, and so forth and so on. But more directly to our topic for today, environmental stress can add to not just, here they don't really define what conflict is. I think you can think of a lot of examples of environmental stress leading to various forms of conflict that we've touched on in this class. Starting with international conflict, it made me think of the soccer war between El Salvador and Honduras back in 1969. During the 60s, around 300,000 Salvadorian migrants lived in Honduras, a large percentage of the population. Honduras gradually in the 60s passed land reform laws, redistributing some of the land that the Salvadorians were living on to Honduran population, which didn't make the Salvadorians too happy, both in Honduras as well as in the home country. During the World Cup qualifying matches, which of course are very high stakes in this region and other regions, led to growing violence between the fans, unfortunately, and it actually escalated to the point where El Salvador launched an offensive a couple weeks later into Honduras. Didn't last that long. It lasted about a week. Some people call it the 100-hour war, with a ceasefire brokered by the Organization for American States. But this is just an example coming from Latin America, in which you had environmental stresses leading to people moving to a destination state, those people being dissatisfied when their destination quality of life and resources were taken away from them by the government, which led to political pressure on the home country to lead to violence. Other more typical forms of violence related to this class would be state versus group conflicts, like Rwandan refugees in the DRC ending up organizing and fighting the Mobutu's government, Liberian refugees in Sierra Leone, Kosovar refugees in Macedonia, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Jordan and Lebanon. That these are conflict survivors that move into destination states and cause political instability in some cases and not in others. There can also be group versus group conflict, which I talked about earlier, native versus migrant populations where they compete over scarce resources. Could be overlapping with ethnic tensions and distrust due to perceived political interests or affiliations and the high stakes that political control has in the destination country. There's a whole bunch of different examples of this. I think the Reuveny article for this week is really interesting in creating in a kind of non-quantitative way, but in just a summarizing way, the table of all these different environmental migration episodes and links to conflict from Bangladesh, as I talked about earlier, Ethiopia, Rwanda, El Salvador, a lot of the cases that we've seen before. And so you can, I mean, this is a general introduction, and it's talking about the general sweep of the driving why people move and the consequences on the destination country. Often they're in developing states, but I think this also has an effect on the destination countries in the developed world. In the earlier years of this class, as it was leading up to Brexit and shortly after Brexit, I think the speed of change in migration, especially after the Schengen agreement in the EU, allowing European Union members to move freely across borders, caused certain parts of the destination country to feel politically sensitive or be unsatisfied with this change and lead them to try to crack down on it. I don't think it's an accident that most of the people in this picture are young and male from a particular region of the world that might drive people to vote a particular way towards leaving the European Union, as the UK did. And you can see where people in this map showed where migrants actually moved around the UK, and you do see high levels in Scotland and in eastern parts of the UK, and you see not necessarily a deterministic relationship between where people are and their support for leaving the European Union. You see Scotland there was clearly interested in staying, while those eastern parts of the UK that had immigration did vote disproportionately in favor of leaving. And so you see this tension between the speed of change and people's willingness to accept it. There's a lot of videos that I could link to on YouTube showing interviews with people before the vote, talking about how important the identity aspects of migration is towards trying to crack down on the speed of movement and the openness to people being able to move within the state. So this is a general introduction for how environmental pressures and migration could theoretically link to conflict. This is also going to overlap with a number of other topics later on in the term, which is why I'm trying to keep it simple here, because then we're kind of like building that pyramid, that theoretical pyramid, to understand conflict, and we're building systematic with each of these blocks. We're adding the migration aspect to it now, and we'll add the other resources and disasters in subsequent weeks. So with that, I think that is but a brief overview of some movement, environmental migration and conflict theories. Now I want to talk about Syria. I have a couple of videos I would encourage you to watch. One that includes Tom Friedman from the McDonald's theory of conflict from a couple of weeks ago. I thought you might find his video from 2017 interesting, where he goes to a Syrian refugee camp and investigates the theories of linking the drought in Syria to conflict, which we're going to talk about in a second. And the second video is a much more theoretical causal pathway video from an academic think tank in Berlin trying to make the theoretical connections in Syria. So if you want the policymaking hands-on video, watch number one. If you want to watch the more theoretical one, you're more welcome to watch the second one. And with that, I'll break in after that to, where's that slide? To talk about the refugee and climate factors overlapping the Syrian conflict. So let's go ahead and take a look at those videos if you have the time, and then we'll come back and link it to the academic political science literature.